The wind along the southern edge of the New Mexico territory did not just blow. It scoured. It stripped the paint from the sides of wagons and the hope from the hearts of men. Daniel McCrae knew the sound of it better than he knew the sound of his own voice. He had lived on this failing stretch of dust and scrub brush for 6 years, ever since the war had spat him out, a broken man seeking a silence he could never quite find. He drove the spade into the hard-packed earth, the metal ringing out like a church bell in the emptiness. The fence post was leaning, rotted at the base, much like everything else on the property. Daniel wiped the sweat from his forehead with a gloved hand, squinting against the mid-morning glare. He was a man carved from the landscape itself, tall and lean. His skin turned the color of cured tobacco by the relentless sun. His beard was thick, shot through with premature gray that matched the weary set of his eyes. Near the barn, the boy was watering the horses. Silas was 14, or perhaps 15, nobody knew for certain. He had wandered onto Daniel's land 3 years ago, starving and unable to speak a word. Daniel had fed him, and the boy had stayed. They suited one another. Silas had no voice, and Daniel had nothing to say. A cloud of dust on the horizon announced a rider long before the horse took shape. Daniel watched the approach without stopping his work. Visitors were rare, and usually heralded trouble. Tax collectors, lost travelers, or men looking for a fight. He rested his boot on the spade and waited. The rider was a young man in a crisp waistcoat that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of sagebrush and red dirt. He pulled his horse up, the animal blowing hard, and looked down at Daniel with an air of self-importance. "Daniel McCrae?" the rider asked, looking at a ledger. Daniel nodded once. The rider smiled, a bright, practiced expression. "I bring news from the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe. You, sir, are a beneficiary of the Frontier Development Lottery." Daniel stared at him. He remembered the lottery. A month ago, a traveling magistrate had pestered him into buying a ticket for $2, claiming it went toward the Veterans Fund. Daniel had paid just to make the man leave. The rider continued, undeterred by Daniel's lack of enthusiasm. "The drawing was held 3 days ago. You have won the 3rd-tier prize. It is a substantial package intended to foster civilization in the San Juan Basin. The deed includes 300 acres of prime valley grazing land, 20 head of cattle, a refurbished homestead cabin, and domestic assistance." Daniel frowned. He looked at his own failing fence, then back at the boy, Silas, who was watching from the barn shadows. 300 acres of valley land was a fortune. It was water, it was grass. It was a life he had stopped dreaming of. "Domestic assistance," Daniel repeated, his voice rough from disuse. The rider nodded enthusiastically. "The governor is committed to solving the labor shortage and the Indian problem in one stroke. The prize includes a servant, contracted to the property for a term of 7 years. You are to report to the stockyards in Santa Fe tomorrow to claim your winnings." Daniel took the paper the man held out. It felt heavy, like a judgment. He did not care about the politics of the territory, but the winter was coming, and his own well was running dry. If there was water in the San Juan Valley, he had to go. He watched the rider gallop away, disappearing back into the heat haze. Daniel looked at the paper again, then crumpled it into his pocket. The stockyards in Santa Fe were a chaotic churning of mud, beasts, and men. The air smelled of manure, unwashed bodies, and raw lumber. Daniel rode his old gelding through the gates, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest that came with crowds. He preferred the company of coyotes to the company of men. He found the lottery commission set up near the auction block. A large banner proclaimed "Prosperity for the Bold." A man named Cunningham, the lottery official, sat behind a makeshift desk, sweating in a heavy wool suit. He had the soft hands of a man who made his living with ink rather than iron. "McCrae," Cunningham said, checking a list. "Excellent. You are the last of the lot to arrive. We have your cattle penned in chute 4. The deed to the land is here, and the girl is over there." Daniel followed the man's pointing finger. He expected to see a sturdy farm wife, or perhaps a young woman from the east, working off a debt. What he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. Chained to a hitching post, sitting in the mud, was a young woman. She was small, her frame thin beneath a torn and dirty buckskin dress. Her black hair was matted, hanging over her face like a curtain. But it was the chains that held Daniel's gaze, iron shackles around her wrists and ankles, the kind used on violent felons. "She is Apache," Cunningham said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. "Part of a raiding party captured near the border last month. The governor has decreed that rather than filling the prison stockades, the women are to be distributed to landowners. Civilize them through labor. It is a mercy. Really?" Daniel stared at the woman. She looked up then, and the air between them seemed to crackle. Her face was bruised, a purple swelling along her cheekbone where someone had struck her. But her eyes were clear, dark, and burning with a hatred so pure it felt like heat against his skin. She did not look like a servant. She looked like a trapped wolf waiting for the hunter to get within range. "I did not ask for a slave," Daniel said, his voice low. Cunningham bristled. "She is not a slave. Mr. McCrae, she is an indentured ward of the territory. You are responsible for her food, shelter, and religious instruction. In exchange, she works your land. I don't want her. Give me the cattle. Keep the girl." Cunningham sighed, tapping his pen on the desk. "It is a package deal. McCrae, the land, the cattle, the girl. You take all of it, or you forfeit the prize. And I should warn you, if you refuse her, she goes back to the holding cells. The soldiers there are not known for their gentleness. Or she gets sold to the mining camps up north. You know what happens to women in the camps." Daniel looked back at the woman. She was watching him, her chin lifted slightly. She knew they were discussing her fate. Yet she offered no plea. She simply sat in the mud, radiant with defiance. Daniel felt a sick twisting in his gut. He had spent 5 years in the cavalry during the early campaigns. He had seen what happened in the stockades. He had seen what happened in the mining camps. If he walked away, this woman would be dead or broken within a month. The memory of smoke and screaming flashed behind his eyes. Unbidden. He pushed it down. "Unlock her," Daniel said. Cunningham smiled. Relieved to be done with the business. "Smart man. I will have the blacksmith strike the ankle chains, but I would advise keeping the wrist restraints on until you get her broken in. She bites. Take them all off," Daniel commanded. Cunningham hesitated, looking at the size of Daniel, at the gun belt hanging low on his hips and the scars visible on his forearms. He signaled the blacksmith. When the iron cuffs fell into the mud, the woman rubbed her wrists. She did not thank them. She stood up slowly. She was taller than she looked sitting down, though still a head shorter than Daniel. She did not move to run. She simply stood and waited, her dark eyes locked on Daniel's face. "Get on the horse," Daniel said, gesturing to the second mount he had brought, a mare he had intended for pack supplies. She did not move. Daniel stepped closer. "I said get on the horse." She looked at him, then at the open gate, then back at him. Before he could react, she gathered the saliva in her mouth and spat. It hit his chest, a wet stain on his dusty coat. The men around them gasped. Cunningham stepped back. "I told you, McCrae, she is feral." Daniel looked down at the spit, then up at her. He did not raise his hand. He did not shout. He took a handkerchief from his pocket, wiped his coat, and looked her in the eye. "Ride, or walk behind in the dust. It is 60 miles. The choice is yours." He turned his back on her and mounted his own horse. He did not look to see what she would do. He simply gathered the lead rope of the pack horse and began to ride toward the gate. For a long moment, there was no movement on the rope. Then, he felt the tension ease as the mare took the weight of a rider. She had climbed up. They rode out of Santa Fe without a word. The 20 head of cattle driven ahead of them by 2 hired drovers Daniel would pay off once they reached the valley. The woman rode behind him, silent as a shadow. The journey took 3 days. They moved through a landscape that was turning brittle with the approaching winter. The cottonwoods along the river bottoms had turned a brilliant, aching gold, and the air held the sharp bite of frost even at midday. They barely spoke. In fact, she did not speak at all. When they stopped to camp, Daniel offered her dried beef and biscuits. She took the food, turned her back to him, and ate. She did not look afraid, which unsettled him. Most captives he had seen were terrified. She was not terrified. She was waiting. Daniel watched her from across the firelight. She sat with a straight spine, staring into the dark. She was young, perhaps 20 years old. Her clothes were rags. He pulled a spare wool blanket from his saddlebag and tossed it toward her. "It gets cold before dawn," he said. She looked at the blanket, then at him. She did not pick it up. She lay down on the bare earth, curling into a tight ball, rejecting his comfort. Daniel watched her for a long time before he finally closed his own eyes. He slept with his revolver under his head, his hand resting near the grip. When they finally reached the valley described in the deed, Daniel had to admit the lottery had not lied about the land. It was a sweeping expanse of high meadow, sheltered by red rock cliffs on two sides and cut through by a fast-moving stream that had not yet frozen over. The grass was thick and yellow, good feed for the cattle. The cabin was sturdy, built of ponderosa pine logs with a stone chimney. It was far better than the shack he had left behind. It had a porch, a solid roof, and glass in the windows. Daniel paid the drovers and watched them ride off, leaving him alone with the cattle, the silence, and the woman. He dismounted and walked up the steps of the cabin, pushing the door open. Inside, it was dusty but furnished. There was a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame in the main room. Off to the side was a smaller room with a door. He walked back out to where she sat on the horse. "This is the place," he said. She slid off the horse and stood looking at the cabin. Her expression was unreadable. "There is a room inside," Daniel said. "You can take the small one. I will take the main room." She walked past him, her moccasins silent on the wood planks of the porch. She entered the cabin, looked around, and walked into the small room. He heard the door close. Then he heard the distinct sound of a heavy latch sliding into place. There was a lock on the inside. Daniel stood in the main room, listening to the silence of the house. He felt like an intruder in his own winnings. He went out to tend the horses and the cattle, working until the sun dipped below the canyon walls and the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. That night, the temperature plummeted. The wind howled down from the peaks, rattling the window panes. Daniel built a fire in the stove, the heat slowly chasing the damp chill from the room. He cooked a meal of beans and salt pork. He walked to the door of her room and knocked once. "Food is ready," he said. There was no answer. He waited. "If you do not eat, you will not have the strength to work. And if you do not work, we do not survive." Still silent, Daniel set a plate on the floor outside her door and walked away. He sat at the table and ate alone, the sound of his spoon scraping the tin plate loud in the quiet cabin. Later, when he blew out the lantern, the plate was still there, untouched. He lay on the bed frame, wrapped in his bedroll. The house felt strange. It was too big. He was used to the boy. Silas sleeping in the loft, the sound of the horses nearby. Here, he was alone with a woman who hated him, isolated by miles of wilderness. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it brought dreams. The canyon was narrow, the walls rising up like the sides of a grave. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the copper tang of blood. Daniel was younger, his uniform blue and dusty. The noise was deafening, screams, gunshots, the terrified whinny of horses. They had been tracking a band of renegades for weeks. The ambush had been sudden. Daniel was firing, reloading, firing again. The smoke obscured everything. A shape moved in the brush to his left, a figure rising up. Reaction was faster than I thought. He swung his carbine. He pulled the trigger, the kick of the stock against his shoulder. The figure fell. The smoke cleared for a heartbeat. It was not a warrior. It was a girl. She could not have been more than 12. She wore a dress beaded with blue glass. She lay in the dirt, looking up at the sky, a red blossom spreading across her chest. Daniel ran to her. He dropped his rifle. He pressed his hands to the wound, trying to hold the life inside her, but it slipped through his fingers like water. Her eyes found him. They were not angry. They were just surprised. The light faded from them slowly, like a lantern turned down. He looked at his hands. They were red. He tried to wipe them on his trousers, but the stain would not come off. It never came off. Daniel woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in the dark. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. He was sweating despite the cold. He rubbed his face with his hands, his breath hitching in his chest. The image of the girl's face was seared into his mind, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, not years ago. He got up, his boots thumping heavily on the floorboards, and added wood to the stove. He found the whiskey bottle in his saddlebag and took a long pull, the liquor burning a path down his throat. It didn't wash away the memory, but it dulled the edges. He looked toward the closed door of the small room. The plate of food was gone. He walked softly to the door and listened. He could hear the faint sound of breathing. She was asleep, or pretending to be. The next few days fell into a brittle routine. The snow began to fall in earnest, dusting the red rocks with white powder. The river developed a crust of ice along the banks. Daniel worked from dawn until dusk, repairing the corral fences, chopping wood, and checking the cattle. The woman, he still did not know her name, for she refused to give it, came out of her room only when he was outside. She would take food from the supplies, cook it, and leave a portion for him on the stove. She cleaned the cabin with a fierce, silent energy. But the moment he stepped through the door, she would retreat to her room and slide the bolt home. She began to venture outside, though never far. He would see her walking near the tree line, gathering kindling or herbs he did not recognize. She moved through the snow with a grace he envied, her moccasins leaving barely a print. She was watching him. He knew, studying him, looking for a weakness. He tried to provide her with better clothing. He found a trunk in the cabin left by the previous owner, containing some wool coats and heavy trousers. He left them outside her door. The next day, he saw her wearing one of the coats, though she had altered it, cutting the sleeves and tying them with strips of leather to fit her frame. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the cabin earlier than usual. The sky was gray and heavy, promising a storm. He stomped the snow from his boots on the porch and pushed the door open. The woman was sitting by the fire. She jumped, startled. She had something in her hands. Before Daniel could see what it was, she shoved it behind her back and stood up, her eyes wide and alert. Daniel paused. "What do you have?" She said nothing. She backed away toward her room. "Show me," Daniel said. His voice was calm, but firm. He did not want violence, but he could not have secrets that might kill him in his sleep. She shook her head. Daniel took a step forward. She pulled her hand from behind her back. In it was a piece of hardwood, perhaps a foot long. She had been shaping it in the fire, hardening the tip, and sharpening it against a stone until it was a needle-point dagger. She held it out, the tip pointed at his chest. Her hand was steady. She crouched slightly, her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. Daniel looked at the weapon. It was crude, but lethal. If she drove that into his neck while he slept, he would be dead in seconds. He looked at her face. He saw the fear behind the anger now. She was alone in a cabin with a man she had been told was her master, a white man, a soldier. She expected him to hurt her. She expected him to force himself on her. She had made the weapon because she believed it was her only choice. He thought of the girl in the beaded dress. He thought of the chains in the mud. Daniel did not reach for his gun. He did not raise his fists. He simply stood there, his arms hanging loose at his sides. He looked at the sharp stick, then up into her dark, defiant eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the sound of the wind outside. "If I were you," Daniel said quietly, "I would have done the same." He saw her blink. The surprise broke the tension in her posture for a fraction of a second. She had expected rage. She had expected a beating. She had not expected him to agree with her. "Keep it sharp," Daniel said. He turned his back on her, an act of insane trust, and walked to the stove to pour himself a cup of coffee. He could feel her eyes boring into his back. He could feel the presence of the weapon in the room. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and stared out the window at the falling snow. He heard the soft click of the latch as she retreated into her room. He did not lock his own door that night. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind, knowing that a woman who wanted to kill him was sleeping 20 feet away with a spear in her hand. And for the first time in years, he felt something other than guilt. He felt a strange, grim respect. The winter was just beginning. The snow was piling up against the walls. They were trapped here together, two ghosts haunting the same house, waiting to see who would freeze first. Daniel closed his eyes. The girl in his dream did not come that night. Instead, he saw the Apache woman's eyes, burning with a fire that refused to go out. The days shortened, slicing away the light until the valley seemed to exist in a perpetual twilight of gray clouds and driving snow. The cabin, once a hollow shell of timber and dust, became a strange ecosystem of silence. Daniel McCrae moved through it like a man walking on thin ice, terrified that a single heavy step would shatter the fragile truce that had settled between him and the woman in the back room. He found himself performing a dance of avoidance that baffled him. He was the owner of this land, the master of the house according to the deed tucked in his drawer. Yet he found himself knocking on his own walls. Before he entered the main room in the mornings, he would rap his knuckles against the door frame, giving her time to retreat or compose herself. He left water for her to wash with, heated on the stove, and then went out to the barn so she could use it in privacy. He watched her from the corner of his eye when she did not know he was looking. She was a creature of fierce, contained energy. She did not walk, she flowed. Even in the heavy wool trousers and oversized flannel shirt he had provided, she moved with a grace that made his own lumbering gait feel clumsy. He had left the clothes outside her door without a word, and the next morning she had emerged wearing them, her buckskin dress folded neatly on the chair. It was an acceptance of necessity, not a gift. One morning, the air was so cold it burned the lungs. Daniel sat at the rough-hewn table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. He had heard her moving in the kitchen area, the soft clink of iron on iron as she stoked the fire. She placed a skillet of cornbread on the table and turned away before he could nod his thanks. "You need boots," Daniel said, his voice sounding loud in the quiet room. She stopped but did not turn. She looked down at her moccasins, which were worn thin, the leather patched and repatched. They were silent hunter's shoes, not meant for the heavy snows of the high country. "I will go to town in a week," Daniel continued, addressing her back. "I will get you leather boots." She did not acknowledge him. She simply walked to the window and looked out at the white expanse, her posture rigid. Daniel sighed and drank his coffee. He was living with a ghost who breathed. The shift happened on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of bruised iron. Daniel had been out since dawn checking the herd. The cattle were huddled in the lee of the canyon wall, miserable and frosted with ice. As he rode the perimeter, he spotted a yearling heifer separated from the group, lying on its side in a drift of snow near the creek bed. He cursed under his breath and spurred his horse forward. The calf was thrashing weak, its leg tangled in a mess of old barbed wire left by a previous tenant. The metal barbs had torn deep into the muscle, and the snow around the animal was stained a shocking, violent pink. Daniel dismounted and wrestled the calf down, trying to calm it, but the animal panicked, kicking out with hooves that could break a kneecap. He struggled to get his wire cutters free from his belt while holding the heaving weight of the beast. Suddenly, another pair of hands was there. Daniel flinched, looking up to see the woman kneeling in the snow beside him. He hadn't heard her approach. She wore the heavy coat he had given her, a wool scarf wrapped around her head. Without a word, she placed her hands on the calf's neck. She did not use force. She pressed her fingers into a specific spot behind the animal's ear and made a low, humming sound in her throat. The effect was immediate. The calf stopped thrashing. Its eyes, wide with terror, rolled back slightly, and its breathing slowed. Daniel stared at her for a second, stunned, then snapped his attention back to the wire. With the animal still, he worked quickly, snapping the rusted metal and unwinding the barbs from the torn flesh. The wound was deep, jagged and ugly, but it had missed the artery. He sat back, breathing hard, wiping blood from his gloves. "We need to get it to the barn. It cannot walk on that." He moved to lift the calf, but the woman was already moving. She scooped up a handful of snow and packed it against the wound to staunch the bleeding. Then she tore a strip from the hem of her own petticoat, the one layer of her old life she still wore under the trousers, and bound the leg tight. It was done with the efficiency of a field surgeon. Together, they hoisted the calf onto Daniel's saddle. He walked the horse back to the barn, the woman walking beside him, her hand resting on the calf's flank to steady it. Inside the barn, the air was warm and smelled of hay and manure. They settled the animal into a stall with fresh straw. Daniel went to the tack room to find the liniment, but when he returned, she was already tending to it. She had found a pouch of dried sage and pine resin in her pocket, things she must have gathered on her silent walks, and was crushing them into a paste. She applied it to the wound, the sharp, clean scent filling the stall. "You have done this before," Daniel said. It was not a question. She did not look up. Her hands moved with gentle assurance, stroking the animal's muzzle. Daniel watched her. He had seen Apache scouts track a man across solid rock, but he had never seen this gentleness. It was at odds with the spit and the knife. It was a reminder that she had a life before the chains, a life of knowledge and skill and care. "Thank you," he said. She paused. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were not filled with the usual hatred. There was a curiosity there, guarded and cold, but present. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then rose and walked out of the barn, disappearing into the blowing snow. That evening, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was no longer the silence of a prison, but the silence of a library, heavy, but filled with unread words. Daniel sat by the fire, mending a bridle. The woman was sewing a tear in his spare shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight. The domesticity of the scene was a lie, but a comforting one. "We need to call you something," Daniel said, not looking up from the leather strap. She did not stop sewing. "I cannot keep calling you her or you," Daniel continued. "And the papers just said servant. That isn't right." He waited. The wood in the stove popped and hissed. Daniel cleared his throat. "My mother's name was Sarah. It is a good name. Or Mary." The needle stopped. "Girl," Daniel said, trying to bridge the gap. "Look at me. You need a name for the census, if nothing else." She slammed the shirt down on the table. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Daniel dropped the bridle, his hand instinctively going to his belt before he stopped himself. She stood up. She seemed to grow in the flickering light, her shadow stretching long against the log wall. Her chest was heaving. The mask of indifference she wore had cracked, revealing a molten core of fury. She walked around the table until she was standing directly over him. She looked down, her face twisted with a mixture of pride and disdain. "My name," she said, her voice rasping from weeks of disuse, low and guttural and fierce. Daniel stared at her, captivated by the sound of her voice. It was the first time she had spoken a clear sentence to him. "My name is not Sarah," she hissed. "It is not Mary. And I am not a girl." She leaned closer, the firelight dancing in her black eyes. "My name is Niall." She said it with the force of a challenge, daring him to reject it, daring him to laugh. "Niall," Daniel repeated. The word felt strange in his mouth, foreign and round. "Yes," she said. She straightened up, pulling her dignity around her like a cloak. "And do not speak to me of your mother." She turned and marched to her room, the door slamming shut with a finality that shook the dust from the rafters. Daniel sat alone in the firelight, repeating the name under his breath. Neil. It sounded like the wind that tore through the canyon at night. It suited her. Weeks dragged on, and the winter deepened. The snow piled high against the cabin walls, insulating them from the world but trapping them with each other. The tension in the house was a physical thing, a wire pulled tight enough to hum. One evening, Neil returned late from gathering firewood. The storm clouds had cleared, leaving a sky of crystalline black, scattered with stars so bright they looked like chips of ice. Her breath plumed before her as she kicked the snow from her boots on the porch. She entered the cabin expecting to find Daniel at the table or by the fire. The room was empty. The stove had burned low. She frowned. It was unlike him to let the fire die. She set the wood down and checked his room. Empty. A cold draft was coming from the back door. She followed it out toward the barn. The barn door was slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. Inside, the lantern hung from a nail, its wick burning low and smoky. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Daniel was sitting on the ground near the tack room, his back against a stack of hay bales. A bottle of whiskey lay on its side near his boot, a dark stain spreading into the dirt. His head was lolled back, his eyes closed. He was shirtless. Despite the freezing temperature, Neil stopped. Her hand went to the small knife she now carried in her belt, a tool, not a weapon, though it could be both. She watched him. He was breathing heavily, a ragged, snoring sound. She took a step closer, intending to leave him there to freeze. He was a white man. He was a soldier. Let the cold take him. Then she saw his back. He had shifted forward, the lantern light washing over his skin. His torso was a map of violence. There were the puckered, circular scars of bullet wounds on his shoulder and side. There was a long, jagged ridge of a knife slash across his ribs. But it was his back that made her breath catch. Crisscrossing the skin from shoulder to waist were thick, raised welts, old scars, silvery and deep, whip marks, not the marks of battle, but the marks of punishment, torture. Neil stared. She knew scars. She had seen the warriors of her tribe return with wounds of honor. She had seen the women cut themselves in mourning. But these were marks of shame, inflicted by his own kind. He groaned, shifting in the hay, and shivered violently. The cold was seeping into him. Neil stood there for a long minute, the cold air biting at her own face. She looked at the scars, then at his face, in sleep. The hardness was gone. He looked old. He looked broken. He was not a monster. He was just a wounded animal, like the calf in the stall next to him. She let out a sharp breath through her nose. She walked to the corner where the horse blankets were piled. She chose the heaviest one, a rough wool square that smelled of sweat and oats. She walked back to him. She did not wake him. She did not speak. She simply draped the blanket over his shoulders, tucking it around him to cover the terrible map on his skin. She stood over him for a moment longer, then picked up the lantern and walked back to the house, leaving him in the dark, but warm. The next day, neither of them spoke of it. But when Daniel came in for breakfast, hungover and pale, he found his coffee was hot, and there was an extra biscuit on his plate. The weather turned vicious in January. A storm rolled in from the north, a wall of white that buried the fences and turned the world into a howling void. The wind was strong enough to strip the shingles from the roof. On the second night of the storm, a leak sprung directly over the main room. Water began to drip, then pour, soaking the floorboards. "We have to fix it," Daniel shouted over the roar of the wind. "If the roof goes, the whole cabin will rot." He grabbed a hammer, a handful of nails, and a tarp. Neil grabbed the ladder. They worked together in the chaos, Daniel climbing up into the rafters from the inside, trying to secure the loose boards while Neil held the brace and passed him supplies. The wind rattled the structure, shaking dust into their eyes. Daniel was stretching, trying to hammer a nail into a wet beam. His foot slipped on the ladder rung. He flailed, grabbing for purchase. Neil lunged forward, her hands clamping onto his waist to steady him. For a second, they froze. Her hands were firm on his hips. He could feel the heat of her palms through his shirt. He was looking down at her, his face inches from hers. He could see the flecks of gold in her black eyes, He could smell the scent of pine smoke and rain that clung to her hair. It was the first time they had touched, really touched, without violence or necessity of medical care. The contact was electric, a shock that went deeper than the skin. Daniel pulled away as if he had been burned. He scrambled up the ladder, putting distance between them, hammering the nail with unnecessary force. "That is good," he choked out, not looking at her. "It is fixed." He climbed down, avoiding her gaze, and moved to the other side of the room. Neil stood by the ladder, her hands slowly curling into fists at her sides. She watched him retreat, her expression unreadable. The tension finally snapped a week later. The sun had come out, blindingly bright, melting the drifts into slush. Daniel had gone into town, a 2-day trip, and returned with supplies. He unloaded the pack horse, carrying sacks of flour and coffee into the kitchen. Neil was sweeping the floor. He placed a small leather pouch on the table. Neil stopped sweeping. "What is this?" she asked. Daniel took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "It is wages. $4. It is the going rate for a ranch hand." She looked at the pouch as if it were a rattlesnake. "I am not a ranch hand. You work like one," Daniel said. "You work harder than one. I will not have you working for nothing. It is your money. You can save it. When the snow clears in the spring, if you have enough saved, you can go." He said the word awkwardly. "Go." Neil dropped the broom. She walked to the table and picked up the pouch. She weighed it in her hand, the silver coins clinking together. Then she threw it. The pouch hit Daniel in the chest and fell to the floor, spilling coins across the wood. "You think you can pay me?" she shouted, her voice rising. "You think silver makes this right?" "I am trying to be fair," Daniel shouted back, his own temper flaring. "I am trying to give you a choice. I am trying to set you free." "Free?" She laughed, a harsh, biting sound. "You think you give me freedom? Because you give me coins, because you do not beat me." She stepped over the spilled money, advancing on him. "I was free before you people came. I was free when I walked the canyon with my brothers. I was free when the wind was the only master I knew. You cannot give me what you stole." Daniel stood his ground, but his face paled. "You are here now. Niall, I am trying to make it bearable. I do not want to be bearable." She slammed her hand against her chest. "I want my life. My brothers are dead. Do you know that?" Daniel went still. "I didn't know. They died in the raid," she said, her voice trembling with a rage so deep it sounded like grief. "They fought. I did not fight. I froze. I stood there and let them put the chains on me because I was afraid to die." She stared at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "I survived because I was a coward. And I learned that if I cry, the soldiers laugh. If I cry, I am weak. So I do not cry. And I do not take your money." She turned away, her shoulders shaking with the effort of holding herself together. Daniel looked at the coins scattered on the floor. He felt small. He felt like a fool. He had thought he was being kind, but he was just being another white man trying to buy his way out of guilt. He knelt down and began to pick up the coins, one by one. He did not offer them to her again. He put them in his pocket. "I am sorry," he said to the empty air. She did not answer. She went to her room and locked the door. February brought the true cold, the kind of cold that snapped tree limbs and froze birds on the branch. A blizzard descended that made the previous storms look like flurries. The cabin was buried. The windows were white rectangles of ice. They were trapped inside for 3 days. The firewood pile in the corner dwindled. The air in the cabin grew stale and close. On the 3rd night, the wind was a constant, shrieking presence. It sounded like voices screaming in the distance. Daniel was lying in his bed in the main room, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind was setting his nerves on edge. Then he heard a different sound. It was faint, coming from Neil's room. A low, rhythmic hitching. A gasp. He lay there, listening. It was the sound of a dam breaking. Daniel got up. He walked to her door. It was unlatched. She had stopped locking it weeks ago, though neither of them had acknowledged the change. He pushed the door open a crack. The room was freezing. Neil was curled on the floor, wrapped in her blankets. She was not sleeping. She was weeping. It was not the polite, silent crying of a woman trying to hide her pain. It was the raw, ugly sobbing of a soul that had held too much for too long. She was shaking with it, gasping for air, her hands clutching her hair. The brothers she had lost, the shame of her capture, the fear, the loneliness. It was all pouring out of her in the dark. Daniel stood in the doorway. His instinct was to leave, to give her privacy. But he knew what it was like to weep alone in the dark. He knew that the darkness could eat you alive if you let it. He stepped into the room. He did not go to her. He did not try to touch her or shush her. He did not offer platitudes. He walked to the wall opposite where she lay and sat down on the floor. He pulled his knees up to his chest and rested his arms on them. He just sat there. Neil froze when he entered, her sobs choking off into sharp gasps. She waited for him to speak, to tell her to be quiet, to mock her weakness. But he said nothing. He breathed steadily, a calm anchor in the storm of her grief. Slowly, the tension left her body. The sobs returned, but they were softer now, less desperate. She cried for her brothers. She cried for the mountains. She cried for the girl she used to be. And Daniel McCrae, the man who had killed a child in a war he hated, sat guard over her grief. He shared the silence, a silent sentinel against the ghosts that haunted them both. They stayed like that for hours, until the wind died down and the gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shutters. Neil had fallen asleep on the floor, exhausted. Daniel stood up stiffly. He took the blanket from the bed she refused to use and covered her. He looked down at her face, swollen and tear-stained, but peaceful in sleep. "Rest. Neil," he whispered. He walked out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. The silence that filled the cabin was no longer a heavy, suffocating thing. It had thinned, becoming something lighter, like the air after a fever breaks. The routine of the ranch had settled over them, a rhythm of chores and meals that bound them together in a way the iron chains never could. Daniel McCrae stood by the corral fence, watching Niall work the horses. The snow had begun to recede, leaving patches of wet. Dark earth exposed to the weak February sun. Neil moved among the animals with a fluidity that made Daniel feel clumsy in his own skin. She was brushing the old sorrel mare, her hands moving in long, soothing strokes. She spoke to the horse in a language Daniel did not understand. The words were soft, guttural, and musical, sliding into the air like smoke. It was Apache. For weeks, the sound of it had made him tense, reminding him of gunfire and ambushes in dry riverbeds. Now, he found himself leaning against the rail, straining to hear it. She turned, sensing his gaze. She did not flinch or look away as she once would have. She paused, her hand resting on the mare's flank. "The water trough is low. Daniel." Daniel blinked. It was the first time she had used his name. It hung in the crisp air between them, stripping away the last artifice of master and servant. She had not called him Mr. McCrae, or Sir, or Boss. She had called him Daniel. "I will fill it," he said, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. He walked toward the well, conscious of her eyes on his back. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was not fear. It was the terrifying realization that he was no longer alone. That evening, the wind picked up again, rattling the loose shingles on the roof they had repaired together. The cabin was warm, the wood stove radiating a fierce heat that pushed back the winter chill. Daniel sat in his chair, cleaning his rifle, the smell of gun oil sharp and familiar. Neil sat across from him on a low stool. She was mending one of his work shirts, the blue flannel worn thin at the elbows. She worked with concentration, her brow furrowed, the needle flashing in the firelight. Daniel stopped wiping the barrel of the gun. He watched her. He traced the line of her jaw, the way her black hair fell over her shoulder, the curve of her mouth when she bit the thread. He realized, with a jolt that nearly made him drop the rifle, that she was beautiful. Not just striking or fierce, but beautiful in a way that made his throat ache. She looked up and caught him staring. Daniel looked down quickly, focusing on the weapon in his lap. "Here," Neil said. She stood up and brought the shirt to him. She held it out. Daniel reached for it. As he took the fabric, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was electric. It was a simple touch, skin against skin. But in the isolation of the cabin, it felt intimate and overwhelming. Daniel felt the warmth of her hand, the callus on her thumb from the needle. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Neil did not pull away. Her eyes searched his face, dark and questioning. Daniel jerked his hand back as if he had touched a hot coal. The shirt fell to the floor between them. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. He turned his back to her, walking to the window where he stared out at nothing but his own reflection in the dark glass. "Daniel?" Neil asked, her voice quiet. "Don't," Daniel said. He gripped the window frame until his knuckles turned white. "What did I do? You did nothing," he said harshly. "It is not you." He heard her step closer. She was not afraid of his anger anymore. She was only confused, and that confusion hurt him more than her hatred ever had. He turned to face her. He looked desperate. A man cornered by his own demons. "You do not know what I am. Neil, you see a rancher. You see a man who feeds the cattle and fixes the roof. But that is not who I am." He held up his hands. They were large, scarred, and shaking slightly. "These hands have done terrible things. I have killed men. I have killed boys. I killed a girl who was no older than you when I was a scout. It was an accident, but she is just as dead." He took a breath, the confession tearing out of him. "I have a violence in me. It is a dark thing, a wolf that lives in my blood. I have spent 6 years trying to starve it. If I touch you, if I let myself want you, I'm afraid of what I will become. I will not use you. I will not be another white man taking what he thinks he owns." The silence that followed was heavy. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Neil looked at him. She looked at his shaking hands, at the fear in his eyes. She saw the monster he thought he was, and she saw the man he actually was. She took a step forward. She did not look away. "You think you are the only one with darkness?" she asked softly. "You think you are the only one who has seen death?" She reached out and took his hand. He tried to pull away, but she held firm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "You are not talking. Daniel!" She stepped closer, until she was standing inside the guard he had built around himself. She looked up at him, her gaze fierce and tender. "Then don't take it," she whispered. "Let me give." Daniel stared at her. The air left his lungs. The wall he had built, the wall of guilt and shame and penance, began to crumble. He did not move. He let her hold his hand. He let the warmth of her touch seep into the cold places of his soul. 2 nights later, the snow began to fall again. Soft, fat flakes that drifted down in the silence. Daniel was in the barn, checking the hoof of the gelding, the lantern cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. The barn door creaked open, and Nayol slipped inside. She wore the heavy coat, shaking the snow from her shoulders. She brought with her the scent of the cold night air. "Is the horse lame?" she asked, walking to stand beside him. "Just a stone," Daniel said. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. They stood close in the narrow aisle between the stalls. The horses chewed their hay rhythmically, a comforting, earthy sound. The heat from the animals kept the barn warmer than the outside, but Daniel could still see Niall's breath misting in the air. She looked at him, and the memory of her words, "Let me give," hung between them. Daniel reached out. He did it slowly, giving her every chance to back away, to pull a knife, to run. He brought his hand up and cupped her cheek. His palm was rough, calloused from years of labor, but his touch was reverent. Nayol leaned into his hand. Her eyes fluttered shut. He lowered his head. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Her lips were cold from the outside air, but they warmed quickly against his. It was soft, tentative, the meeting of 2 people who had forgotten how to be gentle. Then Neil made a small sound in her throat, and her hands came up to grip the lapels of his coat. She pulled him closer. The kiss deepened. It became urgent, a release of months of fear and isolation. Daniel felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with the stove or the whiskey. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her body against his. She felt small but solid, a force of nature in his arms. For a moment, the world disappeared. There was only the smell of hay, the taste of her, the desperate press of her body against his. Daniel's hand moved down her back, pressing her closer. He felt the curve of her waist through the thick wool coat. The hunger in him roared to life, the wolf he had spoken of, wanting to consume her. He pulled back. He broke the kiss, gasping for air. He took her by the shoulders and gently put a few inches of space between them. Niall looked up at him, her eyes wide and dazed, her lips swollen. "Daniel," she breathed. "No," he said, his voice ragged. "Not like this." He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "You are in my barn, on my land, wearing clothes I gave you. The law says you belong to me." He opened his eyes and looked at her fiercely. "I will not have this happen because you have nowhere else to go. I will not have it happen because you are grateful, or because you are cold. When we are together, it will be because you are free, truly free." Neil searched his face. She saw the restraint costing him, the trembling in his arms as he held himself back. She understood then that his refusal was the greatest gift he could offer. It was an act of honor in a world that had shown her none. "Not yet," he whispered. "Okay," she said softly. "Not yet." She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. But the look she gave him before she turned to leave the barn was not one of rejection. It was a promise. The days that followed possessed a strange, dreamlike quality. The tension of the impending spring hung over the valley. Niall began to claim the space around her. She found a deposit of red ochre clay near the creek bed and mixed it with animal fat to make paint. Daniel found the marks a few days later. Inside the barn, high up on the beams where the shadows were deepest, she had painted symbols. There was a jagged line for the mountains, a spiral for the wind, a symbol he did not recognize that looked like a star falling into a hand. He did not ask her about them. He did not scrub them away. He understood that she was writing her existence into the wood of his life. She was no longer passing through. She was staying. It made Daniel realize he had work of his own to do. One morning, while Niall was gathering eggs, Daniel went to the loose floorboard under his bed. He pried it up and removed a heavy wooden box. He carried it out of the cabin, walking past the barn, past the corral, to a lonely cottonwood tree that stood near the frozen riverbank. The ground was hard, but he had a pickaxe. He swung the pickaxe with a grim rhythm, chipping away at the frozen earth until he had a hole 2 feet deep. He set the box down and opened the lid. Inside lay the artifacts of the man he used to be. There was the bronze star, tarnished and dull. There was the yellow silk scarf of the cavalry, stiff with dried blood, the blood of the girl from his dreams. There was a half-empty bottle of whiskey, the liquid amber and inviting. Daniel looked at the items. They were his anchors to the past, the weights that had kept him drowning. He did not feel a grand sense of release. He just felt tired of carrying them. He closed the lid and latched it. He lowered the box into the hole. He shoveled the dirt back in, covering the wood, covering the history. He stomped the earth down flat. He did not mark the spot. He did not say a prayer. He simply wiped his hands on his trousers, turned his back on the river, and walked back toward the cabin where smoke was rising from the chimney. He felt lighter. The ghost of the girl was still there, but she was fading, her voice lost in the sound of the wind. The peace shattered 3 days later. Daniel was chopping wood by the side of the house, the rhythmic thwack of the axe echoing off the canyon walls. The sun was high and bright, the first true day of the thaw. Mud was beginning to replace the snow. The sound of hoofbeats stopped him mid-swing. He lowered the axe, his muscles tensing. He looked down the valley road. A single rider was approaching, picking his way carefully through the slush. Daniel recognized the slouch in the saddle before he recognized the face. It was Harlan Miller. They had served in the same regiment for 2 years. Harlan was a man who enjoyed the war too much, a man who collected ears as trophies and laughed when the villages burned. Daniel leaned the axe against the wall and walked to the front of the porch. He checked the thong on his holster, making sure it was loose. Harlan rode up to the fence line. He was older now, his face puffy from drink, his eyes hard and glittering like polished stones. He wore a dusty duster coat and a hat that had seen better decades. "Well, I'll be damned," Harlan said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "Daniel McCrae, they said you were living up here like a hermit crab." "Harlan," Daniel said, his voice flat, "what brings you this far off the trail?" "Lost my way heading to Durango," Harlan said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "Or maybe I just wanted to see if the rumors were true. Heard you won the lottery, land, cows, and extras." Daniel stood still. The air suddenly felt very thin. "I am busy, Harlan. If you want water for your horse, take it and go." Harlan laughed. It was a dry, scratching sound. "Where is your hospitality? Danny, we bled in the same dirt, didn't we?" The cabin door opened. Daniel froze. He had hoped she would stay inside. Neil stepped out onto the porch. She was holding a basket of laundry. She stopped when she saw the stranger. She wore the flannel shirt and trousers, her hair tied back with a leather strip. She looked strong, healthy, and undeniable. Harlan's eyes went to her, and a slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He looked her up and down, lingering on her chest, stripping her with his eyes in a way that made Daniel's vision blur with red rage. "Well now," Harlan drawled, "look at that. They said you got a wild one, but she looks housebroken enough to me." Neil stood rigid. She recognized the look in this man's eyes. She had seen it on the soldiers who captured her. "Get back inside." "Neil," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. Harlan chuckled. "Nayol, you gave it a name? That is cute. Does she do tricks, Danny? Or is she just keeping the bed warm on these cold nights?" Daniel took a step off the porch. His hand hovered near his gun. "Watch your mouth, Harlan, or I will shut it for you." Harlan held up his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes remained cold. "Easy, soldier. No need to get touchy about a piece of government property. I just figured an old friend might be willing to share. It gets lonely on the road." Daniel moved so fast Harlan didn't have time to blink. He crossed the distance to the horse, grabbed Harlan by the lapel of his duster, and nearly dragged him out of the saddle. The horse danced sideways, whinnying. Daniel shoved him back. "Hard. Ride on. Harlan. Now. Before I forget we served together." Harlan righted himself in the saddle. His hand dropped to his own gun, but he saw the look in Daniel's eyes. The cold, dead stare of a man who had buried his past and was ready to make a new ghost. Harlan hesitated. He was a bully, and bullies knew when they were outmatched. He spat again, the tobacco landing near Daniel's boot. "You are making a mistake." "McCrae," Harlan said, his voice losing its jovial edge. "You think you are hiding up here? People talk in town. They know you have got a hostel up here. They know you are not treating her like a servant." He looked past Daniel at Niall. "Enjoy her while you can. Danny, the territory is changing. We are cleaning up the trash. And there is a price on anything that refuses to be tamed." Harlan wheeled his horse around violently. Mud sprang from the hooves. He kicked the animal into a gallop, riding back down the valley without looking back. Daniel stood in the mud, his chest heaving. The adrenaline was coursing through him, bitter and sharp. He turned to look at Niall. She had dropped the laundry basket. She was standing on the porch, her face pale, staring at the retreating figure of the rider. She did not look at Daniel. She looked at the horizon, where the world outside was waiting to crush the fragile life they had built. Daniel walked back to the porch. He wanted to touch her, to reassure her, but he knew his hands were shaking with rage. "He is gone," Daniel said. "For now." Niall said. Her voice was hollow. She bent down and picked up the laundry. When she stood up, the softness that had grown in her over the last few weeks was gone. Her eyes were hard again. The warrior had returned. "We should prepare," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. He looked at the spot where he had buried the box of his past. He realized with a sinking heart that you could bury the past, but you could not bury the world. The news did not arrive with a fanfare of trumpets, nor with the thunder of galloping hooves. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the mute boy, Silas, who had ridden the old mule down to the trading post at the crossroads for salt and nails. When he returned, the boy was pale, his face drawn tight with a fear that made him look younger than his 14 years. He did not unload the supplies. Instead, he walked straight to Daniel, who was repairing the latch on the barn door, and handed him a folded piece of paper. It was a broadsheet, the ink cheap and smudged, likely printed on a hand press in the back of a saloon in Durango. Daniel wiped his hands on his trousers and unfolded it. The wind caught the edges, making the paper snap like a dry twig. Wanted. The bold letters declared, "Escaped hostiles. Reward for capture or confirmed kill." Below the headline was a list of names, anglicized and butchered versions of Apache names. And there, near the bottom, was the description that made Daniel's blood run cold. One female, approximately 20 years of age, goes by the name Nile, property of the Territorial Development Commission, absconded from lawful custody, dangerous. The reward listed was $500. Daniel stared at the number. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a new herd, to build a house of stone, to leave the territory forever. It was also enough to turn every desperate drifter, wolf hunter, and out-of-work soldier in the San Juan Basin into a killer. He looked up at Silas. The boy made a gesture, drawing a finger across his throat, then pointed back toward the road. He had seen men reading the posters. He had seen the hunger in their eyes. Daniel crushed the paper in his fist. The peace they had built, the fragile, quiet life of the last month, evaporated in the span of a heartbeat. He walked to the cabin. Neil was inside, kneading dough for the evening bread. She looked up as he entered, her face dusted with flour. She saw the look in his eyes, the return of the soldier's 1,000-yard stare, and her hand stopped moving. "They are coming," Daniel said. He threw the crumpled paper onto the table. Neil picked it up. She could not read the English words, but she recognized the drawing of the chains at the bottom, and she recognized the name Cunningham signed with a flourish at the end. "The man who sold me," she said. It was not a question. "He wants you back," Daniel said. "Or he wants you dead. The paper says you escaped. It says you are hostile." Neil looked at the paper, then at the fire. He covers his greed with laws. Daniel moved to the gun rack on the wall. He took down the Winchester repeating rifle and the double-barreled shotgun. He began to check the actions, the metallic clack-clack sounding loud in the room. "Pack a bag," Daniel said, not looking at her. "Take the dried beef. Take the heavy coat. Take the sorrel mare. She is the fastest." Neil wiped the flour from her hands. "Where am I going?" "North," Daniel said. "Into the high peaks. There are passes. The snow still blocks for horses, but you can cross on foot. If you leave now, you gain a day on them." He turned to hand her a box of ammunition, but she was not moving. She stood by the table, her hands resting on the dough, her feet planted firmly on the floorboards. "No," she said. Daniel froze. "Niall, this is not a debate. $500 brings the devil to the door. You cannot stay here. I am not running," she said. Her voice was calm, anchored by a steel resolve. "I ran before. I ran until my lungs burned and my brothers died. I ran until I was caught and chained. I am done running." She picked up the knife she used to cut the dough. She tested the edge with her thumb. "This is my home," she said. You are my choice. I will not leave you to fight my war." Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides and gripped her shoulders. "Niall, listen to me. If they take you, they will hang you. Or worse, I can hold them off. I can buy you time. You cannot hold off an army alone." "Daniel McCrae," she said, looking up into his face. "But two of us might make them regret the journey." He looked into her eyes, obsidian hard, glittering with the fierce pride of her ancestors. and knew it was useless to argue. She had made her stand. She was not the terrified girl in chains anymore. She was a warrior who had found her ground. Daniel let out a long breath, releasing the tension in his shoulders. He nodded once. "Then we fortify," he said. They spent the rest of the afternoon turning the cabin into a fortress. Daniel boarded up the windows, leaving only narrow slits for rifle fire. He filled barrels with water and brought them inside in case they tried to burn them out. He moved the heavy oak table against the door. Neil worked beside him, silent and efficient. She brought the horses into the main room of the barn and barricaded the doors, creating a secondary firing position. She checked the lines of sight from the loft. She gathered the few medical supplies they had, bandages, whiskey, a needle and thread, and laid them out on the side table as the sun began to dip below the canyon rim, casting long purple shadows across the valley. The reality of their situation settled over the house. The world had narrowed down to these 4 walls and the stretch of mud between the porch and the tree line. Silas had vanished into the loft of the barn. Armed with an old squirrel rifle Daniel had given him, the boy would watch the rear approach. Night fell, heavy and moonless. The wind picked up, moaning through the eaves like a dying man. Inside the cabin, Daniel doused the lantern. They sat in the glow of the fireplace, the only light in a world of darkness. The waiting was the hardest part. It gave a man time to think, time to count his regrets. Daniel sat in his chair, his rifle across his knees, staring into the flames. He thought of his wife, dead from fever 10 years ago. He thought of the girl he had killed in the war. He thought of the empty years he had spent seeking silence. And now, here he was, about to die for a woman the world said was his enemy. And the strange thing was, he did not feel regret. He felt a terrifying clarity. The door to the back room opened. Daniel did not turn. He knew her footsteps by heart now. Neil walked into the room. She had shed the heavy wool coat and the work trousers. She wore only the simple cotton shift she slept in, her bare feet silent on the wood. The firelight caught the hollow of her throat, the curve of her arms. She stopped beside his chair. "You should sleep," Daniel said, his voice rough. "If they come, it will be at dawn." "I cannot sleep," she said. She reached out and took the rifle from his lap. She set it gently against the wall. Then she took his hand. "Come," she whispered. Daniel looked up at her. Her face was open, unguarded in a way he had never seen. The anger was gone. The fear was gone. There was only a raw, naked honesty. She pulled him to his feet. He followed her, not to her room, but to the rug in front of the fire. The heat from the hearth washed over them. She stepped close to him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady, heavy thud of his heart beneath his shirt. "We may die tomorrow," she said softly. "I know," Daniel answered. "I do not want to die without knowing this," she said. "I do not want to die a prisoner. I want to live, even if it is only for tonight." She began to undo the buttons of his shirt. Her fingers were steady. Daniel stood paralyzed for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer proximity of her, by the scent of sage and wood smoke that clung to her skin. Then, with a groan that sounded like something breaking, he reached for her. They came together not with the frantic desperation of strangers, but with the deep, aching gravity of two souls who had been orbiting each other for a lifetime. When he kissed her, he tasted the salt of her skin and the sweetness of the air. He lowered her to the rug. The firelight painted her skin in shades of copper and gold. He traced the lines of her body with hands that had known only violence and labor, marveling at the softness of her. He kissed the bruises that had long since faded from her wrists. He kissed the scar on her shoulder where a soldier's quilt had struck her. He worshipped the history written on her flesh, and she claimed him in return. She ran her hands over the ridges of the whip marks on his back, touching the pain he had hidden from the world. She did not flinch from his scars. She accepted them. She pulled him down to her, wrapping her legs around him, anchoring him to the earth. When they moved together, it was a language older than English or Apache. It was raw and fierce, a defiance of death. It was a declaration that they were alive, here, now, in this circle of firelight. Daniel buried his face in her neck, breathing her in, losing himself in the rhythm of their bodies. For the first time in his life, the noise in his head stopped. The guilt, the memories, the war, it all fell away. There was only Neil. When the end came, it was a shuddering release that left them both gasping, clinging to each other as the world spun slowly back into focus. They lay tangled together on the rug, the fire popping softly beside them. Daniel pulled the heavy buffalo robe over them, cocooning them against the chill of the room. Neil rested her head on his chest. He could feel the dampness of tears on his skin. He stroked her hair, his hand trembling slightly. "You are crying," he whispered. "Not from sadness," she murmured, her voice thick. "From letting go. I have held myself so tight for so long. Daniel, I forgot what it was to breathe." Daniel tightened his arm around her. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Niall." The words were out before he could weigh them. He had not meant to say them, but they were the truest thing he had ever spoken. He felt vulnerable, exposed, terrified that she would pull away. She still went against him. She did not speak. She did not offer the words back. In her culture, words were cheap. They drifted away on the wind. Love was not something you said. It was something you did. It was the wood chopped, the wound bound, the weapon sharpened. Instead of speaking, she shifted, lifting her head to look at him. Her eyes were shining. She leaned forward and kissed him, slow, deliberate, and tender. It was a kiss that sealed a pact. It was an acknowledgement of the bond that had grown in the silence of the winter. She laid her head back down on his chest, her hand resting over his heart. "Sleep," she whispered. "I will listen for the wind." Daniel closed his eyes, holding the woman he loved, knowing that dawn would bring the end of the world. The morning arrived with a deceptive beauty. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun crested the canyon rim, turning the mud of the valley floor into a sea of gold. Daniel woke to the sound of metal on metal. He sat up. Niall was already awake. She was sitting on the stool near the window. She had found his shears, the heavy iron scissors he used for trimming the manes of the horses. She gathered her long, black hair in one hand, pulling it taut away from her scalp. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked, his voice hoarse from sleep. Neil did not look at him. She closed the blades of the shears. With a sickening crunch, she cut through the thick lock of hair. It fell to the floor, a dark pool of silk. She cut again, and again. She hacked the hair short, until it hung jagged and rough around her jawline. It was a severe, brutal cut. It stripped away the softness of her face, leaving only the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the burning intensity of her eyes. "It is the morning cut," Daniel said quietly. He had seen Apache women do this after a battle. "It is the war cut," she corrected him. "Long hair is for peace. Long hair is for a woman who has a home to tend. Today, I am not that woman. Today, I am the wind that cuts the stone." She stood up, shaking the loose strands from her shift. She had dressed in the trousers and flannel shirt, cinching the belt tight. She looked smaller without the hair, but more dangerous. She walked to the door and looked out through the slit in the wood. "They will ride up the wash," she said. "The ground is solid there. We must make them regret the path." She went out the back door, moving low and fast. Daniel watched her from the window. She moved into the tree line near the creek. She was crafting traps. He saw her bend saplings, tying them back with rawhide thongs, sharpening stakes to drive into the mud. She worked with terrifying creativity. She strung a tripwire of baling wire across the narrowest point of the trail, at neck height for a rider. She dug a shallow pit in the soft earth and concealed it with a brush, lining the bottom with broken glass from a shattered whiskey bottle. She was turning the land itself into a weapon. Daniel dressed quickly, strapping his gun belt on. He felt the weight of the revolver on his hip, a familiar comfort. He checked the load in the Winchester again. When Neol returned to the cabin, she smelled of pine pitch and cold earth. She carried a handful of rocks, smooth and round river stones. She placed them on the windowsill. "What are those for?" Daniel asked. "To gauge the range," she said, "and to distract." They waited. The sun climbed higher. The silence of the valley stretched tight, a drum skin waiting to be struck. At noon, the birds stopped singing. Daniel tensed. There, a cloud of dust rose at the far end of the valley. It moved steadily toward them. Daniel lifted the heavy bar and dropped it across the door. He picked up his rifle and took his position at the window facing the road. Neil took the other window, the shotgun resting easily in her hands. The riders took shape. There were 6 of them. In the lead, Cunningham rode. He looked out of place in the saddle, his city suit dusty, a bowler hat perched on his head. But the men flanking him were not bureaucrats. They were hard men, wearing long dusters and carrying rifles across their saddles. Bounty hunters, hired guns. They rode boldly, right up to the fence line, stopping 50 yards from the porch. They knew Daniel was there. They knew he was watching. Cunningham raised a hand, and the riders halted. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his forehead. Though the air was cool, "Mr. McCrae!" Cunningham shouted, his voice thin and reedy in the vast space. "I trust you received our notice." Daniel did not answer. He sighted down the barrel of the Winchester, aiming for the center of Cunningham's chest. "We know she is in there," Cunningham called out. "We have a warrant for the seizure of territorial property, and we have a writ for the arrest of one Daniel McCrae for harboring a fugitive." Daniel nudged the shutter open with the barrel of his rifle. "She is not property," Daniel shouted back. His voice boomed across the yard. "She is a free woman, and you are trespassing?" Cunningham laughed. It was a nervous sound. "The law says otherwise. McCrae, the law says she belongs to the state, and the law says you are in a great deal of trouble." He gestured to the men around him. "These gentlemen are deputies of the court. We are authorized to use deadly force to reclaim the asset. Do not throw your life away for a savage. McCrae, you are a white man. You are a veteran. Come out, hand her over, and we can discuss leniency regarding your fine." Daniel looked at Niall. She was watching the riders, her finger resting on the trigger of the shotgun. She did not look at him. She was calculating distances, angles, and wind speed. "I am not coming out," Daniel yelled. "And if any man crosses that fence line, I will bury him here." One of the riders, a man with a scarred lip and a long buffalo gun, spat on the ground. He raised his rifle. Cunningham held up a hand to stop him. He was a coward, and he did not want a shootout if he could avoid it. He wanted the girl intact. She was worth nothing to him if he couldn't collect the labor fees from the mines. "Have it your way, McCrae," Cunningham shouted. "But we are not leaving. You have until dawn." He pulled a gold watch from his vest pocket and made a show of checking it. "At first light, we come in, and if we have to burn this shack down to get her out, we will. You have one night to decide if she is worth dying for." Cunningham wheeled his horse around. The riders followed suit, pulling back to the tree line at the edge of the property, beyond effective rifle range. They dismounted and began to set up a camp. Daniel saw the flare of a match as they lit a fire. They were settling in for a siege. Daniel lowered the rifle. His heart was hammering against his ribs. "They will wait for the light," Daniel said. "They want to see what they are shooting at." Neil stepped away from the window. She looked at her short hair in the reflection of the glass. "They give us the night," she said quietly. "That is their mistake." She turned to Daniel. A grim smile touched her lips. "The Apache owns the night." Daniel looked at the woman he loved, the woman who had cut her hair to fight beside him. He saw the trap she had laid in his mind, the strategies, the desperate plans. He walked to her and took her face in his hands. "We do not wait for dawn," he said. "No," she agreed. "We do not." Outside, the sun began its slow descent, bleeding red across the sky. The long night was beginning, and in the camp at the tree line, the men laughed and passed a bottle, thinking they had the rancher and the girl trapped. They did not know that inside the cabin, the trap was already sprung. The hour before dawn was not black. It was a heavy, suffocating gray. The air inside the cabin was cold, the fire having died down to a bed of sullen red coals. Daniel McCrae moved through the darkness with the silence of a man who had spent half his life trying not to be heard. He did not light a lantern. He knew the geography of this room by heart now. He knew where the table stood, where the rifle leaned against the wall, and where the woman he loved was sleeping on the rug. Only she was not sleeping. As Daniel reached for his boots, Neil sat up. The movement was fluid, like water rising. In the dim light from the embers, her eyes were open and alert. She had sensed his intention before he had even acted on it. "You are saddling the horse," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of an accusation. Daniel did not look at her. He pulled his boot on, the leather stiff with cold. "I am for whom?" "For you." He stood up and walked to the back door, moving the barricade aside with careful, deliberate motions. He slipped out into the night, crossing the frozen mud to the barn. Neil followed him, snatching up her coat and wrapping it around her shift. Inside the barn, the air was thick with the scent of hay and horse sweat. Daniel worked quickly, cinching the saddle onto the sorrel mare. He tied a bedroll behind the cantle and stuffed the saddlebags with dried beef, a canteen of water, and the small pouch of coins he had tried to give her weeks ago. He turned to face her. She was standing in the aisle, shivering slightly, her arms crossed over her chest. The short, jagged hair she had cut the day before framed her face like a helmet of war. "You are sending me away," she said. Daniel stepped closer. He took her shoulders in his hands. His grip was hard, desperate. "There are 6 men out there. Niall, maybe more is coming. They want you. If you are here when the sun comes up, they will burn this barn and the cabin to get to you." "We fight," she said. "We agreed. We lost." Daniel corrected her. He looked deep into her eyes, trying to pour every ounce of his will into her. "I can hold them off from the cabin. I can buy time. But I cannot fight them and worry about you at the same time. You are the target. If the target is gone, they have no reason to siege the place." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of folded parchment. It was a map he had drawn by the light of the fire while she slept. "Go north," he said, pressing it into her hand. "Stick to the tree line. Cross the river at the oxbow where the water is shallow. 2 days' ride from here is the canyon you told me about, the one with the red cliffs. Wait for me there." Neil looked at the map, then at him. She crumpled the paper in her fist. "You lie," she said. "You will not come. You are staying here to die. I am staying here to finish this," Daniel said. He grabbed the reins of the mare and led the horse toward the back door of the barn, which opened out into the dry creek bed. It was the one blind spot in the enemy's perimeter, a narrow chute of darkness that led into the timber. He forced the reins into her hand. "Ride, Niall," she stood her ground. "I am not a coward. I do not run while my heart stays behind." Daniel felt a sob rise in his throat, but he choked it down. He grabbed her waist and lifted her bodily into the saddle. She struggled for a second, her hands pushing against his chest, but he was stronger. "This is not about bravery," he hissed. "This is about survival. If you love me, if you truly choose me, then you will live. Do not let them put those chains back on you. Do not let them win." He slapped the mare's rump hard. The horse lunged forward, startled, and scrambled up the bank of the creek bed. Neil fought for control, turning in the saddle to look back at him. Her face was a mask of anguish. "Go!" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. She hesitated for one agonizing second. Then, she saw the look in his eyes, a plea so profound it broke her resistance. She kicked the horse, and the animal disappeared into the gloom of the pines, her hooves muffled by the soft earth of the wash. Daniel stood in the open doorway of the barn, watching the darkness where she had vanished. He listened until the faint rhythm of the gallop faded into the wind. He was alone. He walked back to the cabin. He did not hurry. He felt a strange, icy calm settle over him. It was the feeling he used to get before a battle, the moment when fear was replaced by the simple mechanics of duty. He went inside and rebuilt the fire. He brewed a pot of coffee, strong and black, He drank a cup standing by the window, watching the eastern sky turn from gray to a bruised purple when the sun finally crested the ridge, blinding and brilliant. Daniel walked out onto the porch. He carried the Winchester in his right hand, the barrel pointing at the ground. In his left hand, he held a sheaf of papers. The camp at the tree line stirred. Men shouted. Horses whinnied. Cunningham rode out first, flanked by his hired guns. They stopped at the fence line, rifles raised. "Good morning, Mr. McCrae," Cunningham shouted. He sounded confident, rested. "I see you are awake. Is the girl ready to travel?" Daniel stepped down off the porch and walked to the center of the yard. He stopped 10 paces from the fence. He looked at the men. They were ugly, hard-faced men who killed for money. He looked at Cunningham, a soft man who was killed with ink. "She is gone," Daniel said. His voice was flat, carrying easily in the cold air. Cunningham's smile faltered. "Gone? That is impossible. We have had the perimeter secured all night." "She is Apache," Daniel said. "She was gone before you poured your first cup of coffee. She is 10 miles into the high country by now. You will never catch her." The man with the buffalo gun cursed and spat. "I told you we should have moved in last night." Cunningham's face turned a blotchy red. "You are lying. McCrae, she is in the cellar, or under the floorboards." "She is free," Daniel said. He lifted the papers in his left hand. "This is the deed to this land," Daniel said. "And this is the indenture contract for the servant known as Nile." He struck a match on the rough denim of his thigh. The flame flared, bright and small against the morning sun. He touched it to the corner of the papers. The dry parchment caught instantly. The fire curled the edges, turning the legal script into black ash. "What are you doing?" Cunningham shrieked. "That is government property." "That is a legal document. It is kindling," Daniel said. He held the burning papers until the flames licked his fingertips. Then he dropped them into the mud. He watched them burn until there was nothing left but gray flakes drifting on the breeze. "There is no slave here," Daniel said. "And there is no rancher. There is just a man who is tired of your voice." "Get him," Cunningham screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "Kill him." The air exploded. Daniel moved before the echo of the command had died. He dropped to one knee, bringing the Winchester up. He did not aim for Cunningham. The man was a fool, not a fighter. He aimed for the man with the buffalo gun. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The man was thrown backward out of his saddle, his chest ruined. Bullets tore into the ground around Daniel, kicking up sprays of frozen mud. He worked the lever of the rifle, the brass casing spinning through the air. Clack-bang! A second rider, a bearded man in a duster, grabbed his shoulder and slumped over his horse's neck, his rifle falling to the dirt. Daniel scrambled toward the cover of the water trough. A bullet caught him before he made it. It felt like being struck by a sledgehammer. The impact spun him around, slamming him into the wood of the trough. A line of fire erupted in his left side, just above the hip. He gasped, the air leaving his lungs. He fell behind the trough, clutching his side. His hand came away wet and red. The firing stopped for a moment. "He is hit," someone shouted. "Rush him." Daniel gritted his teeth against the pain. It was a white-hot, sickening throb that radiated down his leg. He pulled himself up, resting the barrel of the rifle on the edge of the trough. 3 riders were charging the fence, spurring their horses. Daniel fired. He missed the first man but hit the second horse. The animal went down screaming, throwing its rider into the mud. The man scrambled up, terrified by the chaos, and ran back toward the trees. The other 2 riders pulled up hard, their horses rearing. They had expected a frightened farmer. They had found a soldier who had buried his fear years ago. Daniel fired again, knocking the hat off one of the men. That was enough. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. They saw 2 of their own down, and the ranchers still shooting with lethal precision. They wheeled their horses around. "Retreat!" one of them yelled. "To hell with this!" They galloped back toward the tree line, leaving their wounded comrade groaning in the mud. Cunningham was already gone, his horse kicking up a trail of dust as he fled back toward the road. Daniel watched them go. He tried to stand, to fire one last shot, but his legs refused to hold him. The world tilted sideways. The sky, so bright and blue, began to turn gray at the edges. He slid down the side of the trough, sitting in the mud. He pressed his hand against his side, trying to hold the blood in. He looked at the burnt remains of the papers a few feet away. He smiled. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment, he told himself. Just to rest. The sun moved across the sky, indifferent to the man bleeding in the yard. The silence returned to the valley, broken only by the cawing of crows that had gathered to inspect the dead man by the fence. Daniel drifted in and out of the darkness. He dreamed of water. He dreamed of the girl with the beaded dress. But this time, she did not look at him with surprise. She looked at him with forgiveness. The shadows lengthened. The cold began to seep into his bones, numbing the pain of the wound. He knew, with a detached sort of clarity, that he was dying. He heard the sound of hooves. He opened his eyes. The light was failing. The sun was gone behind the canyon wall, leaving the world in a soft, gray twilight. They had come back. They had come to finish it. Daniel tried to lift the rifle, but his arm was too heavy. It lay in the mud. Useless. The horse thundered closer. It did not stop at the fence. It jumped the rail, landing heavily in the yard. Daniel turned his head. It was not Cunningham. The rider vaulted from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. She hit the ground running. Niall? She was a blur of motion. She fell to her knees beside him in the mud. Her face was streaked with dust and tears. "You fool!" she choked out. "You stubborn, foolish man!" Daniel tried to speak, but his mouth was dry as ash. "Go!" he rasped. "Be quiet," she commanded. She grabbed him under the arms. She was small, but she possessed a frantic, terrifying strength. She heaved him up, dragging him through the mud toward the porch. Daniel tried to help, but his legs were dead weight. He groaned as his wound tore open fresh. "I have you," she gritted out, her teeth clenched. "I have you." She dragged him up the steps and into the cabin. She pulled him to the rug in front of the fireplace. She kicked the door shut and dropped the heavy bar into place. She did not stop to rest. She lit the lantern. She threw fresh wood on the dying fire, stoking it until the flames roared. She knelt beside him and tore his shirt open. She looked at the wound. The bullet had entered low on the side, missing the gut but tearing through the muscle. It had gone clean through. Neil let out a breath she had been holding. "It is not inside," she said. "That is good." She went to the stove. She poured water into a basin. She took the bottle of whiskey from the shelf. She took her sewing kit. She worked with the same focus she had used to stitch the calf, but her hands were trembling now. She forced them to be steady. She cleaned the wound with water. Daniel hissed through his teeth, his body arching off the rug. "Drink," she said, holding the bottle to his lips. He swallowed the fire. It burned almost as much as the hole in his side. She threaded the needle. She sterilized it in the flame of the lamp. "This will hurt," she said. She began to stitch. The pain was blinding. Daniel gripped the edge of the rug until his fingernails tore. He focused on her face. He focused on the line of her jaw, the sweat on her forehead, the fierce, unyielding love in her eyes. As she worked, the room seemed to fade away. Flashback. The memory came to him not as his own, but as if she were pouring it into him through the needle and thread. A canyon, deep and red, echoing with the sound of running water. Niall was a child, no more than 6. She was sitting on a flat rock, her hair being brushed by a woman with kind eyes and hands that moved like birds. The wind was howling through the narrows, a wild, lonely sound. "Do you hear that?" her mother asked in Apache. "It is loud," the child said. "It is your name." Her mother said, "Neil, the wind." Her mother turned her around, looking into her face. "Remember this, little one. Men build walls to keep the wind out. They build cages to hold it. But the wind cannot be caged. It moves where it wills. It breaks what is brittle and flows around what is strong." Her mother kissed her forehead. "But even the wind must rest. It does not stay because it is trapped. It stays because it finds a place that welcomes it. It stays because it chooses to—" The image faded. Daniel opened his eyes. Neil was tying off the last stitch. She bit the thread with her teeth. She sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on her trousers. Her chest was heaving. Daniel lay still, the pain settling into a dull, rhythmic throb. He looked at her. "You came back," he whispered. Neil looked down at him. Her eyes were dark and unreadable. "I rode to the river," she said. "I crossed the water. I looked at the mountains." She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his cheekbone. But the mountains were empty. The canyon was just rocks. She leaned over him, her face inches from his. "You do not tell me where to go." "Daniel McCrae, I am not a package to be sent away. I am not a child to be saved." She kissed him, softly, tasting of salt and smoke. "I choose you," she said. The words hung in the air, heavier than the timber beams of the roof. "I choose you." It was the only freedom that mattered. Daniel reached up and covered her hand with his own. "They will come back," he said. "Not Cunningham. He is a coward. But others, the law, I know," she said. "We cannot stay here. This house, this land, it is a trap now." Neil looked around the cabin. She looked at the sturdy walls they had repaired. She looked at the hearth where they had cooked. She looked at the barn where she had painted her soul into the wood. "It is just wood and mud," she said. She looked back at him. "The land was never ours. Daniel, it belonged to the earth before you came, before I came. We cannot own it." She squeezed his hand. "But love," she asked, "this thing between us, this we can own. This is the only ground they cannot take from us." Daniel nodded slowly. The pain in his side was still there, but the fear was gone. He looked at the woman who had ridden back into the valley of death for him. "Help me up," he said. "You cannot move." "We have to move," Daniel said. "We have an hour of light left. We need to be gone before the moon rises." Neil hesitated, then nodded. She understood. If they stayed, they died. She helped him sit up. He groaned, his face going pale, but he set his jaw. "Pack what we can carry," he said. "Leave the rest. Leave the cattle. Leave the furniture." They moved through the cabin like ghosts dismantling a life. Neil packed food, ammunition, and blankets. Daniel took the money from his hidden box, what little was left, and his good knife. He looked at the bronze star lying on the table, the one he had dug up from the riverbank. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, and then tossed it into the fire. He did not need medals for courage anymore. They walked out into the dusk. The air was cold and sharp. The dead man by the fence was a dark shape in the gloom. Neil brought the horses around. She helped Daniel mount the gelding, his movements stiff and pained. She mounted the sorrel mare. They did not look back at the cabin. They did not look back at the valley that had brought them together and tried to destroy them. They turned their horses north, toward the high passes where the snow still lay deep and the air was too thin for cowards. Niall took the lead. She did not look like a servant, or a captive, or a wife. She looked like the wind, cutting a path through the stone. And Daniel followed her, leaving everything behind but his heart. The ascent into the high country was a slow, agonizing climb toward the sky. They left the rolling foothills and the muddy valley floor behind, trading the scent of wet sage for the sharp, resinous smell of ponderosa pine and thin air. The trail Niall chose was not a trail at all. It was a memory etched into the stone, a deer path that wound through scree fields and narrow granite passes where the wind screamed like a wounded animal. Daniel McCrae rode in a haze of pain. The bullet wound in his side was a knot of fire that throbbed with every hoofbeat of the gelding. He gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles, his vision tunneling to the swaying hips of the sorrel mare ahead of him. Neil rode with her back straight, her eyes scanning the ridge lines for pursuit. She was the compass and the captain now. Daniel was merely cargo. They rode for 3 days without a fire. They feared the smoke would be a signal fire to the men Daniel had left bleeding in the mud. They ate dried beef that tasted like leather and drank icy water from snowmelt streams that numbed their teeth. On the 4th day, the terrain turned against them. They reached a river, the Animas, swollen with early melt and choked with ice flows. The water was a churning gray torrent that cut across their path, blocking the way to the northern peaks. "We have to cross," Neil shouted over the roar of the water. "The pass is on the other side." Daniel looked at the river. He looked at his horse, which was shivering and exhausted. He looked at his own hands, shaking with fever. "The current is too strong," he said, his voice weak. "The horses will not make it. They will make it if we lead them," Niall said. She dismounted. She stripped off her heavy coat and tied it to the saddle. She took the reins of the mare and walked into the freezing water without hesitation. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath. But she pushed forward, the water rising to her waist, then her chest. Daniel had no choice but to follow. He slid from the saddle, his legs buckling as they hit the ground. The pain in his side flared white-hot, nearly sending him to his knees. He grabbed the gelding's bridle and stumbled into the river. The water was agony. It was colder than ice. It was a living, crushing weight. It seized his muscles and tried to drag him downstream. The current slammed him against a hidden boulder, tearing the breath from his lungs. He lost his footing. The water closed over his head, dark and roaring. For a moment, he thought about letting go. It would be easy to just drift, to let the river wash away the pain and the struggle. Then a hand grabbed the collar of his shirt. It was a grip of iron. Neil hauled him up, her face twisted with effort. She was fighting the current, the horses, and his dead weight all at once. "Stand up!" She screamed. "You do not die here. Daniel, stand up!" He found his footing on the slick river rocks. He gasped for air, coughing up water. He looked at her. She was soaked, her lips blue, her eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying will. She was not asking him to move. She was commanding him to live. They fought the river together, inch by agonizing inch, until the water swallowed and they collapsed on the far bank, shivering and gasping on the frozen mud. They did not speak. They could not. Neil dragged the blankets from the wet saddles. She stripped Daniel of his soaked clothes, her fingers numb and clumsy. She pressed her body against his under the wool, sharing her heat, willing her life into him until the shivering stopped and exhaustion took them both. The weeks that followed were a blur of hardship that stripped them down to the bone. They moved deeper into the wilderness, into a land of towering peaks and silent, shadowed valleys where no white man's map had ever been drawn. Food became scarce. The dried beef ran out. Daniel was too weak to hunt. The fever from his wound came and went like the tide, leaving him sweating and delirious. Niall became the provider. She set snares for rabbits. She broke the ice on the creeks to spear trout. She found roots and pine nuts, meager offerings that kept them alive one day at a time. Daniel watched her transformation with a sense of awe. The girl who had been chained in the stockyards, who had been a silent ghost in his kitchen, was gone. In her place was a woman of the mountains. She moved through the woods with a predator's grace. She read the weather in the clouds and the movement of the elk. She was competent, lethal, and magnificent. She became his strength. When he could not walk, she supported him. When he could not eat, she fed him. When the fever dreams took him back to the war, to the blood and the screaming, her cool hand on his forehead brought him back to the quiet of the forest, and he became her peace. At night, when the darkness pressed in and the memories of her lost brothers and the cage threatened to overwhelm her, Daniel would hold her. He would tell her stories of the ocean, which he had seen once as a boy, a body of water so big it had no other side. He would speak to her in a low, steady voice until her breathing evened out and she fell asleep safe in the circle of his arms. One evening, caught in a spring squall that turned the world white, they took shelter in a shallow limestone cave halfway up a ridge. The wind howled outside, a frustrated demon clawing at the stone. Inside, they huddled by a small fire of smokeless juniper wood. Daniel sat with his back against the wall, his legs stretched out. The wound was healing. Finally, the angry red had faded to a dull pink, and the skin was knitting together. Neil was sitting near the entrance, watching the snow fall. She held Daniel's hunting knife in her hand. She was scratching something into the soft limestone of the cave wall. "What are you writing?" Daniel asked. She did not answer immediately. She worked the point of the blade into the stone, blowing the dust away softly. "Marks," she said. "To say we were here, to say we existed." Daniel pulled himself up and limped over to her. He looked at the wall, carved into the rock. In jagged, uncertain lines were two names, Daniel, and beside it, copied from the way he had written it in the dirt for her once, Niall. They were side by side, not one above the other, not master and servant, not rescuer and rescued. Equals, two stones in the same stream. "You put me first," Daniel said quietly. Niall looked up at him. Her eyes caught the flicker of the firelight. "You are the foundation," she said. I am the wind that moves around you. Without the rock, the wind has no voice. Without the wind, the rock is just a stone in the dark." She handed him the knife. Daniel took it. He reached out and carved a circle around the two names. It was a crude circle, uneven and rough, but it enclosed them both, binding them together in the stone forever. "We are the world now," Daniel said. "Just us." The storm broke 2 days later, revealing a sky of piercing, impossible blue. They packed their meager camp and crested the final ridge. Niall stopped. She stood on the edge of the drop-off. Looking down, her chest heaved. Daniel came up beside her. He looked down, and his breath caught in his throat. Below them lay a hidden canyon, protected on all sides by sheer cliffs of red sandstone that glowed like embers in the sunlight. A river wound through the center, a ribbon of turquoise water lined with cottonwoods that were just beginning to show the bright green of spring buds. It was a secret garden, a pocket of warmth and life tucked away in the brutal heart of the mountains. "This is the place," Niall whispered. "It is beautiful," Daniel said. She pointed to a bend in the river, where the cliffs rose high and curved inward, creating a natural amphitheater. "My mother brought me here," she said. "She told me that this is where the spirits of the earth come to rest. She told me that if I ever lost my way, if I ever lost my soul, I should come here and wait for the earth to find me." She turned to Daniel, tears standing in her eyes. "I thought I would come here to die. Daniel, when I was in the chains, when I was in your house, I thought about this place. I thought I would run here, lie down by the water, and let the cold take me. I thought it was the only freedom left." Daniel took her hand. He squeezed it, feeling the calluses and the strength in her fingers. "And now?" he asked. She looked at the valley, then back at him. "Now, I do not want to die. I want to live. I want to see the leaves turn gold in the autumn. I want to see the snow melt in the spring. I want to do it with you." She squeezed his hand back. "This is not a grave, Daniel. It is a home." They descended into the canyon. The air grew warmer as they went down, the wind losing its bite. They made camp by the river, under the spreading branches of an ancient cottonwood tree. They did not build a ranch. The square angles of the white man's architecture felt wrong here, an imposition on the curve of the land. Instead, they built something that belonged to both of them. They worked through the spring and into the summer. They gathered stones from the river and logs from the fallen timber. They built a structure that was half cabin, half hogan. It was round, like the Apache dwellings, with the door facing east to greet the sun. But it had a stone chimney and a solid roof, built with the carpentry skills Daniel had learned from his father. They mixed the mud with their bare hands to chink the walls. They cut the grass from the river bank to thatch the roof. They worked side by side, sweating in the sun, their bodies growing lean and hard. It was a labor of love, a physical manifestation of the life they were forging. Every stone they placed was a promise. Every log they lifted was a vow. In the evenings, when the work was done and the fireflies danced over the water, they sat by the river and taught each other the world. Daniel had a small, battered Bible he had carried in his saddlebag, not for the religion, but for the words. He taught Niall to read. He taught her the shapes of the letters, the sounds they made. "This is tree," he would say, touching the bark of the cottonwood. "Tree, tree," she would repeat, testing the heavy English rolling on her tongue. "This is water," he said, dipping his hand in the river. "Water. This is husband," he said, pointing to himself. She laughed, a sound that was rare and bright like a bird call. "Husband," she said, and she taught him. She taught him the language of the land. She taught him that the wind had different names depending on the direction it blew. She taught him that the river was not just water, but a living vein of the earth. "Gawa," she said, pointing to the round house they had built. "Gawa," Daniel repeated. "It means home," she said, "but it also means the place where the fire burns." She placed her hand over his heart. "Hadi'i," she whispered. "Hadi'i," Daniel said. "Soul," she explained. "The part of you that does not bleed when you are cut." "And Ashud," she said, looking at the stars wheeling overhead. "Ashud?" "Forever," she said. "It means until the mountains fall down." Summer turned to autumn. The cottonwoods flamed into gold, mirroring the red of the cliffs. The air grew crisp again. They harvested the small garden they had planted, corn, squash, and beans. They smoked the venison from the deer Daniel had hunted. They were ready for the winter. But this winter was different. There was no dread. There was no silence filled with unspoken hate. There was only the comfort of a larder full of food and a bed wide enough for two. On the night of the first snow, the wind returned. It came howling down from the peaks, rushing through the canyon with a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices singing at once. Daniel woke up to find the bed empty. He sat up, his heart hammering for a second before he remembered where he was. He was not on the ranch. He was not in the war. He was home. He saw the door standing open. He threw a blanket over his shoulders and walked out into the night. Niall was standing by the river. The snow was falling around her, large, lazy flakes that hissed as they hit the dark water. She was wearing only her shift, her arms raised to the sky, her face turned toward the wind. She was speaking. The words were Apache, low and urgent, carried away by the gale before Daniel could catch them. He waited until she lowered her arms. She stood there for a moment, her head bowed, letting the snow settle on her dark hair which had begun to grow out again, softening the edges of the war cut. He walked up behind her and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, pulling her back against his chest. "You will freeze," he said gently. She leaned back into him, her body radiating heat. "I was speaking to them," she said. "To the spirits?" "Yes, to the wind, to my mother, to the ancestors who watch from the cliffs." Daniel rested his chin on the top of her head. "What did you tell them?" She turned in his arms so she could look at him. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her eyes were warm. "I told them they do not need to worry about me anymore," she said. "I told them that the chains are broken. I told them I am no one's slave, I am no one's servant, I am no one's prize." She reached up and touched his face, her thumb brushing his cheek. "I told them I chose a man." Daniel felt a lump rise in his throat. He covered her hand with his own. "And what did they say?" he asked hoarsely. She smiled. "They said that the man is lucky, and that the wind has finally found a place to rest." The wind howled around them, shaking the branches of the trees, swirling the snow into dancing spirals, but in the circle of their arms, there was no cold, there was no fear. Daniel kissed her. It was a kiss of gratitude, of passion, of a love that had survived the fire and the flood. "Let's go inside," he said. "To the Gawa." "Yes," she said, "to the place where the fire burns." They walked back toward the house they had built with their own hands. The firelight spilled out of the open door, a rectangle of gold in the blue dark of the winter night. They stepped across the threshold together and closed the door against the storm. Outside, the snow fell, covering their tracks, covering the path that led to the outside world, sealing them into their sanctuary. Inside, there was warmth. Inside, there was love. And for the first time in the history of the canyon, and in the hearts of the two people who lived there was freedom. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey of survival, redemption, and a love that defied the brutal laws of the frontier. I hope Niall and Daniel's story resonated with you as much as it did with me while writing it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment down below and tell me which part of the world you call home And if you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please make sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel so you never miss an adventure. Feel free to share your thoughts on the ending in English in the comments section. Until next time, keep the fire burning.